In the deep, relentless cold of Eastern Europe, where the snow falls thick and heavy, a woman named Anya trudged through the frozen landscape that had once been her home. The air was biting, the wind sharp and unforgiving, and the ground beneath her feet was an icy sheet that seemed to stretch on forever. It had been weeks since she had last seen any sign of human life. The small, isolated village she lived in was slowly being consumed by the brutal cold of winter, a cold that seemed to seep into her very soul. It was December 1942, and the war, like a dark shadow, had loomed over her entire existence for years now. Anya's life had once been full of light and warmth. She had been a young woman full of hope, married to a man who was her everything. Her husband, Mikhail, was a farmer, strong, kind, and deeply in love with her. Together, they had built a modest home on the edge of the village, just far enough from the noise of the town square but close enough that they could feel the pulse of life around them. The fields surrounding their home had once been a patchwork of greens and browns in the spring and summer, the place where Mikhail would work tirelessly, plowing and sowing, while Anya took care of their small garden and the household. They had plans, dreams of a future filled with children and laughter, and the peaceful days that seemed far away now. But that was before the war. Anya had heard the stories of soldiers marching into their villages, of men being taken away, of families torn apart. Her heart sank as the first signs of the conflict reached their small home. A knock on the door one fateful evening, a soldier demanding food and shelter. Mikhail had been forced into the army, leaving Anya alone, her world crumbling with each passing day. She tried to carry on, as the war stretched on, turning the world around her into a battlefield. The warmth that once existed between her and her husband was now a memory, a distant ache in her chest. The news of his death had reached her only a few months earlier. He had fallen at the front, taken by the sharp edge of a bullet. His letters stopped coming, the once frequent communication between them lost in the fog of war. Her son, Alexei, had been the only light left in her life. At the time of Mikhail's death, Alexei had been just a child, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened. He was only 5 when the war had taken everything from them. But Anya tried to shield him from the worst of it, filling their days with stories, pretending that everything was okay. She would tell him that his father would be home soon, that they would go back to the way things were, but deep down, she knew the truth. The war had changed everything, and there was no going back. Despite her efforts, the harsh reality of war was inescapable. Anya had witnessed firsthand the cruelty of the soldiers who passed through their village. Men from all sides of the conflict, their faces etched with anger, their hearts cold from the violence they had seen and inflicted. There was nothing sacred to them. Everything was an opportunity for brutality. It wasn't just the enemy forces who were capable of such inhumanity. Her own people, too, were corrupted by the war. She had heard whispers of the atrocities being committed by both sides. Her trust in humanity had withered, and she was left with a deep, consuming sense of fear. And then came the raid. It had been a night like any other, cold, still, and filled with the sound of the wind howling through the trees. Anya had wrapped herself in the threadbare blankets of her bed, trying to sleep, but the weight of everything, the loss, the fear, the cold, kept her awake. She could hear Alexei's gentle breathing beside her, his small body curled up in the warmth she could provide. The world outside seemed far away, as if it were frozen in time. But that night, something was different. At first, it had been a distant rumble, a sound that could have been mistaken for thunder. But the rumble grew louder, closer, and Anya's heart quickened. She had lived through many nights of uncertainty, but this felt different. There was an urgency to it, a presence she could not ignore. She rose from her bed, pulling on her thickest coat, and moved quietly to the window. The faint glow of firelight flickered on the horizon, casting eerie shadows over the snow-covered earth. It wasn't long before the sound of boots crunching through the snow could be heard outside, followed by the harsh voices of men shouting orders. Her blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. The soldiers had arrived. She did not know which side they were from, but it hardly mattered. Their presence meant violence, chaos, and destruction. Anya's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. She had to protect Alexei. She had to keep him safe. She glanced around her small home, searching for a place to hide him, to shield him from whatever was about to happen. But before she could act, the door burst open with a deafening crash, and the room filled with the smell of sweat and gunpowder. The soldiers stormed in, their boots stomping across the wooden floor, their rifles swinging at their sides. Their eyes were wild, feral, hunger and desperation etched into their faces. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, looked at Anya with a cold, calculating gaze. His eyes flicked to her son, who had woken up from the noise and was now cowering beneath the covers. Anya stepped forward, her body shaking, but her resolve hardening. She would not let them take Alexei. They did not care for her resistance. One of the soldiers lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin as he yanked her to the side. She cried out, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The leader barked orders, and before Anya could react, her son was torn from her arms, his terrified screams echoing through the room. The soldier pushed her back with a shove that sent her crashing into the wall. The darkness of the room, punctuated only by the flickering light of the fire outside, seemed to close in around her as she lay there, breathless and broken. She tried to rise, but the world around her spun, and the pain in her chest intensified. It was not just the physical blows, it was the emotional agony of losing her son, of feeling helpless, of realizing that in a world ruled by war, there was no room for mercy, no room for love. The soldiers took what they wanted, food, clothes, anything of value, and left. When the door slammed shut behind them, the silence that followed was suffocating. Anya remained on the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She could not cry. There were no tears left. All she had now was an overwhelming emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch on forever. She dragged herself to her feet, her body aching, and staggered toward the door. There was no time for grief. No time for surrender. She had to find Alexei. She had to bring him back. The cold wind hit her face as she stepped outside, but it was not the cold that made her shiver. It was the realization that she was alone now, with nothing but her determination to guide her. The war had taken everything from her, but it had not yet taken her will to survive. As she began her search, every step felt heavier than the last, every breath a struggle against the bitter cold. But in that moment, Anya knew one thing for certain. She would not give up. Not now. Not ever. Corporal William Hawkins was no stranger to the ravages of war. He had seen things in the past few years that had shattered the man he once thought he was. His hands, once steady and certain, now trembled as he applied bandages to wounded soldiers, his fingers unsure as they worked. Every time he touched another man's flesh, it was as though he were reminded of his own vulnerability, the fragility of life in the midst of a war that felt like it would never end. In the stillness of the night, when the faint crackle of distant gunfire filled the silence, he would sit by the small campfire, his eyes unfocused, his thoughts drifting to places he didn't want to go. Hawkins had not always been like this. Back home in England, he had been a hopeful, idealistic young man who joined the army not out of necessity, but out of a sense of duty. His country needed him, and he believed, with all the fervor of youth, that his service would mean something. That belief had long since been stripped away. The horrors of war had replaced any idealism he had once held. The brutality, the senseless deaths, the endless suffering, it all weighed on him, until he began to wonder if anything had meaning anymore. As a medic, Hawkins had always believed that his role was to save lives, to heal the wounded and ease their pain. But it had become a cruel joke. The battlefield was a place where he could do little more than delay the inevitable, patching up bodies only to watch them be torn apart again in the next skirmish. He had seen men come to him with terrible wounds, their eyes wide with fear and pain, and he had done what he could to comfort them, but it never felt enough. And in the quiet moments between battles, when he lay awake in the darkness, he would think about how many lives had slipped through his fingers, how many men he had failed to save. It was during one of these long nights that Hawkins found himself thinking of home, of the life he had left behind. He thought of his parents, who had sent him off with a proud smile and a hope that he would return a hero. He thought of his younger sister, Marjorie, who had written to him once a week, her letters full of the trivialities of daily life, things he could barely remember anymore. He remembered the smell of the English countryside, the soft rolling hills, and the warmth of the hearth in his family's cottage. That world felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone he used to be. And in the silence of the cold, war-torn world he now inhabited, he longed for that simpler time. His yearning for home, however, was always interrupted by the reality of the war around him. There were always new orders, new skirmishes, and new wounds to tend to. His unit had recently been relocated to the Eastern Front, where the snow piled up in thick drifts and the cold cut through their clothing like a blade. The landscape was a barren wasteland, punctuated only by the occasional ruined building or abandoned tank. The soldiers, huddled together in makeshift camps, tried to keep their spirits up, but the frigid air and constant threat of enemy attack made it impossible to find any warmth, whether physical or emotional. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape, Hawkins and his comrades were sent to tend to a group of soldiers who had been injured in a recent attack. The order came quickly, the urgency of the mission clear in the officer's voice. Hawkins grabbed his medical pack and hurried to join the others. They were to move quickly, no time for hesitation. But as they made their way toward the front lines, Hawkins felt a creeping sense of dread settle in his chest. It was not the fear of the enemy that troubled him, he had become numb to that, but something else, something deeper. He felt the weight of the task ahead of him, the knowledge that he would be facing another round of desperate pleas for help that he could not answer. The casualties were more than he had expected. It wasn't just the wounds, gunshots, shrapnel, burns, but the sheer volume of the men who needed assistance. Hawkins moved swiftly, working alongside other medics to stop the bleeding, stabilize the wounded, and administer whatever aid they could. His hands moved mechanically, performing their duties without thought, as if his body had taken over from his mind. He could hear the groans of pain from the men around him, the sounds of soldiers calling out to their comrades, asking for reassurance that they would survive. But Hawkins knew better than to offer false hope. He could not promise survival to anyone. His thoughts drifted, once again, to the war's meaning, or lack thereof. What was the point of all this suffering? The war was pushing everyone to their limits, testing their endurance and their capacity for pain. He had seen men break, mentally, physically, emotionally, and he was not sure how much longer he could endure it himself. And yet, he kept moving forward, because that was what soldiers did. They pushed through the fear, the grief, the exhaustion, and they kept fighting. As the night wore on, Hawkins came across a soldier who had been seriously injured. The man's leg was mangled, blood pooling around him as he lay in the snow, his face twisted in pain. Hawkins knelt beside him, his breath visible in the cold air. He had seen many men in worse conditions, but something about this soldier struck him. The soldier's eyes, wide with terror, seemed to plead with Hawkins, not just for medical aid, but for a sense of humanity, for a connection in a place where connection seemed impossible. Hawkins quickly set to work, trying to stabilize the man as best as he could, but in his heart, he knew it was too late. The soldier's condition deteriorated rapidly, and Hawkins could do nothing but watch, his hands trembling as he worked, his mind racing with the weight of what was happening. The man's breathing grew shallow, and his eyes began to glaze over. Hawkins could feel the weight of his own helplessness, the crushing realization that there was no way to stop the inevitable. In the end, the soldier died in his arms, his last breath a soft, mournful exhale that seemed to carry with it the sadness of the entire world. Hawkins closed the man's eyes and said a prayer for him, but it felt hollow. What was the point of prayers when everything felt so broken? It was then, as the cold wind howled through the night and the sounds of the battlefield seemed to fade into an unbearable silence, that Hawkins made a decision. He could not keep going like this. He could not continue to be a part of a war that offered nothing but death and suffering. The years of fighting, of witnessing atrocities, of losing men who had once been his comrades, they had worn him down to nothing. He had joined this war with the hope of making a difference, of being a healer, but instead, all he had done was patch up wounds that would never truly heal. As he trudged back to his camp, the weight of the night's events heavy on his shoulders, Hawkins began to wonder if there was any way out. Could he leave the war behind, escape the cycle of death that seemed to be tightening around him? Was it even possible to walk away from something so all-encompassing, so inevitable? Or was he, like all the other men around him, trapped by the cruel forces of fate, a pawn in a game far larger than himself? His mind churned with these questions as he lay down to sleep that night, his body aching and his heart weary. But sleep was elusive, and his thoughts continued to spiral. The faces of the men he had lost, the cries of the wounded, and the cold, endless snow, they all swirled in his mind like a storm that could never be quelled. Hawkins knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. The war had taken too much from him, but he could not yet bring himself to walk away from it thither. He was trapped in a cycle, and he knew that the only way out was through. The snow was relentless. It had been falling for days, the world outside transformed into a ghostly blur of white and gray, as if nature itself had decided to erase everything it had touched. Anya stood at the window, staring out at the desolate landscape, the bitter wind howling through the cracks in the walls of her small home. Her eyes, once bright with hope, had dulled with the weight of everything she had lost. Her heart felt like it was slowly being crushed beneath the unbearable burden of grief, the loss of her husband, and now, the sudden, inexplicable loss of her son. The soldiers had come without warning, like wolves descending upon a wounded creature. Their footsteps had crunched in the snow outside, their voices harsh and guttural as they approached her village. Anya had heard them long before they reached her door, the sound of boots crunching through the snow, the indistinct chatter of men, the occasional shout. But it had been too late by the time she realized what was happening. There had been no time to think, no time to prepare. The door had exploded inward with a deafening crash, the soldiers flooding into her home, their eyes wide with hunger and desperation. She had barely been able to react before they were upon her, rough hands tearing at her, pushing her aside, ripping the warmth from her as if it were something they had a right to. Alexei, her little boy, had been fast asleep in the bed beside her. He had no idea what was happening, no understanding of the violence that had suddenly erupted in their once peaceful world. His small, innocent face had been nestled in the pillow, his soft breaths the only sound in the room. But the moment the soldiers entered, he woke with a start, his eyes wide with fear. The sight of his mother being shoved aside, the sound of the soldiers shouting and grunting, it had terrified him. Anya had tried to protect him. She had thrown herself between him and the soldiers, screaming at them to stop, her voice hoarse and desperate. But they had not cared. The men had been rough, indifferent, as though they had no understanding of the human cost of their actions. One soldier had grabbed Alexei, pulling him away from her, his small body struggling against the soldier's grasp. Anya had reached out, her arms trembling, but the soldier had only shoved her aside, knocking her to the floor. "Mom!" Alexei had cried out, his voice filled with terror, the sound of it echoing through her chest. "Don't take him! Please!" Anya had begged, her voice breaking as she scrambled to her feet, her hands reaching out toward him. But the soldier's grip had been ironclad, his face expressionless as he dragged Alexei away from her. She had watched in helpless horror as they pulled her son out of the room, his cries for her fading as he was taken from her sight. Every second felt like an eternity, the world around her moving in slow motion as the soldiers continued their pillaging, tearing through her home as if it were nothing more than a place to plunder. Anya could feel the heat of her own blood rising, the rage and desperation filling her chest like a storm. But there was nothing she could do. She had been stripped of everything, her husband, her son, her home, and in that moment, she felt more powerless than she had ever been in her life. The soldiers left soon after, taking whatever they could carry, food, clothes, any valuables they could find. They did not care for the destruction they left behind, the shattered pieces of Anya's world lying in their wake. They had come in with violence and left with indifference, leaving her alone, broken, her heart shredded beyond repair. The cold that filled the room was unbearable. Anya could feel it in her bones, the sharpness of it seeping through her skin. She stood frozen for a moment, as if time had stopped, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. Her knees gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her hands trembling as she reached for her son's discarded blanket. The smell of the soldiers, the sound of their boots on the floor, the echoes of Alexei's cries, It all clung to the room like a suffocating fog. For what felt like hours, Anya sat there, staring at the empty space where her son had been moments before. Her mind could not grasp the enormity of the loss, the feeling that something so vital, so irreplaceable, had been taken from her. It was not just the physical absence of Alexei, it was the way the world felt smaller now, as though the very fabric of her life had been torn apart, leaving nothing but a gaping hole where love and warmth had once been. She did not know where they had taken him or why. The soldiers had not said a word to her, had not given any explanation for their cruelty. To them, she was nothing more than another casualty of the war, a nameless, faceless woman whose pain meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. But to Anya, Alexei was everything. He was her reason for living, the light in the darkness, the only piece of Mikhail she had left. Without him, the world seemed cold and endless, like the storm that raged outside. Anya could feel the tears welling in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had no time for tears, no time for grief. If she allowed herself to weep, she might never stop, and she could not afford to be weak. Not now. Not when Alexei needed her. She stood up slowly, her body stiff with exhaustion and pain. The chill of the room seemed to press against her, suffocating her with its emptiness. But she forced herself to move, forced herself to take the first step toward something, anything, that would give her the strength to carry on. She had to find Alexei. She had to get him back. The snow outside was falling harder now, the ground covered in a thick blanket of white. The village was eerily quiet, the sounds of the raid having long since faded into the distance. Anya stepped outside, her breath visible in the freezing air. She had no plan, no idea where to begin her search, but she knew one thing: she could not stay here. Not while her son was out there somewhere, lost and alone. She pulled her coat tighter around her body, the wind cutting through the fabric, and set off into the snow, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. Her thoughts raced as she moved, the image of Alexei's face, the terror in his eyes, driving her forward, step by painful step. The pain in her chest was a constant ache, but she ignored it, just as she ignored the cold, the fear, and the exhaustion that weighed down on her like an anchor. Anya's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the soldiers or her son. She had no idea which direction they had gone, but she would follow every trail, every piece of evidence, until she found him. She would not stop until he was back in her arms. She would not allow herself to succumb to despair. The landscape around her seemed to stretch on forever, the snow and wind creating a world that was both vast and suffocating. She was alone in this cold, unforgiving place, but she refused to let that truth break her. She would find Alexei. She would fight for him, just as she had fought for their life together before the war had torn it all apart. Anya's journey was just beginning, but she had already made up her mind. She would not rest until her son was safe. The village was no longer what it had been. In the midst of the relentless war, the small cluster of homes that had once dotted the snow-covered landscape now seemed like skeletal remnants of a forgotten past. The place where Anya had once lived with Mikhail, where laughter had filled the air and the warmth of a fire had kept the harsh winds at bay, had been ravaged, not only by the passage of time but also by the violence of the soldiers who had come and gone. The smell of burning wood still lingered in the air, mixed with the chill of the frozen earth, a reminder of the loss that had washed over everything. After the soldiers had taken Alexei, Anya had no idea where to turn. She had spent hours wandering through the snow, her body weary from exhaustion, but her mind sharp with the single thought of finding her son. There had been no sign of him. No tracks in the snow, no hint of where they had gone. She had searched the perimeter of the village, moving from one abandoned house to the next, but there had been nothing. The soldiers had taken him, and with him, they had taken her hope. But the wind had whispered a different story as the night fell, as it always did in the war. Somewhere in the distance, there had been the sound of boots crunching through the snow, the distant chatter of voices. Something had caught her attention. At first, she had thought it was the wind, but the voices were too distinct. She had heard them before, the same guttural sounds of men who had no respect for the lives they destroyed. They were not far, perhaps a few hundred meters from where she stood, and for a brief moment, she thought about turning back, about retreating to the safety of the ruins that had once been her home. But she couldn't. Not when there was still a chance to find Alexei. Without thinking, she moved toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest, her every step careful and deliberate. The wind stung her face, but she hardly felt it. The cold was nothing compared to the icy grip that fear had on her heart. She kept moving, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, praying that with every step, she was drawing closer to her son. It didn't take long before she saw them, the soldiers. They were gathered around a small fire, their figures silhouetted against the orange glow of the flames. Anya's pulse quickened as she peered through the trees, her breath shallow and quick. She crouched low, trying to keep herself hidden from view, her eyes scanning the men who sat there in the cold. They were laughing, loudly and recklessly, as though nothing in the world could touch them. They spoke in broken fragments of German and Russian, their conversation incomprehensible but tinged with the arrogance of men who believed they were beyond reproach. Anya's mind raced. She had no idea what to do, how to approach them. Her heart told her to rush in, to shout, to demand her son back, but her instincts told her that doing so would only lead to disaster. She could already feel the familiar cold terror creeping up her spine, the fear of what these men were capable of, the horrors they had already shown her. But she had no choice. If she wanted to save Alexei, she had to act. She moved as quietly as she could, her footsteps muffled by the thick snow beneath her boots. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured. The soldiers were distracted, too busy with their coarse laughter and crude jokes to notice her approach. She had to get closer, closer to them without being seen. There was no other way. The darkness of the night seemed to engulf her as she slipped between the trees, moving steadily forward. She kept her body low, staying in the shadows, her heart thudding in her chest like a drum. As she neared the fire, she could hear the men clearly now, their laughter growing louder. And then, as if the night itself had conspired against her, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, sitting at the edge of the fire, was Alexei. Her son, bound by rope and huddled in the corner of the campfire's glow, looked terrified. His small face was pale, his eyes wide and filled with confusion. He had been crying. Anya could see the tear stains on his cheeks, his hands pressed tightly together in front of him as though trying to hold on to some last shred of comfort. She froze in her tracks, the sight of him igniting a surge of emotions she had not anticipated, relief, anger, grief, and fear, all of it mingling into a single overwhelming force. For a long moment, she just stared at him, taking in the sight of her son, so close yet so far away. The sight of him, alive but in the clutches of the soldiers, was more than she could bear. The men had taken him from her, but he was still here, still in her reach. She just had to act. But she couldn't rush in recklessly. She couldn't let her emotions drive her. She had learned that in the past weeks, since Mikhail's death, since the war had come crashing into her life, nothing was simple anymore. Every choice carried consequences, every decision had the potential to lead to ruin. She had to be smart. She had to think. Anya's eyes darted around, scanning the area for anything that might give her an advantage. The soldiers were still distracted, but their movements were erratic, unpredictable. They had weapons, and they were drunk on power. The last thing she wanted was to anger them, to give them an excuse to take more than just her son. She crouched lower, hiding behind the trunk of a tree, and began to assess the situation. There were 5 soldiers in total. 4 were gathered around the fire, their faces obscured by shadows, while the 5th, the one who had been holding Alexei, stood a little further away, keeping watch over the camp. He was the closest, and if Anya was going to make her move, it had to be now. Her breath was sharp in her throat, her pulse thudding in her ears as she watched the soldier. He was looking away, his back to her, distracted by something in his hand. She could hear the faint sound of him muttering to himself, lost in the oblivion of the cold and the fire. This was her chance. Anya moved again, slipping through the snow like a shadow, her body low to the ground. Every muscle in her body screamed with tension, but she ignored it. She was close now, so close she could almost reach out and touch Alexei. She could see the way his small body trembled in fear, his lips pressed tightly together to keep from crying out. He hadn't seen her yet, He didn't know she was here. The soldier, oblivious to her approach, continued to stand with his back turned. She reached for the small knife at her belt, the only weapon she had, and held it firmly in her hand, the cold steel a reassuring presence in her grip. She had no plan other than to get her son back. There were no strategies here, no tricks. It was just the raw instinct of a mother desperate to save her child. As she closed the gap, she felt the wind shift, biting at her face, but she pressed forward, steadying herself with a deep breath. She was almost there. One more step. One more moment. In that final instant, as she lunged forward, her heart racing with the rawness of the moment, the soldier turned. He saw her too late. Anya's knife flashed in the darkness, cutting across his arm before he had a chance to react. The soldier grunted in pain, stumbling backward in shock as he dropped his weapon. It was enough. It was just enough for her to close the distance between them, to shove him aside and grab Alexei, pulling him into her arms with a force born of sheer desperation. The boy gasped in shock, his arms wrapping around her as if he were holding on for dear life. She could feel his trembling body against her, feel the warmth of his small frame despite the chill of the night. The soldier, still reeling from the sudden assault, shouted a curse and lunged toward her, but she was already moving, pulling Alexei with her as she sprinted into the darkness. The sound of the soldier's footsteps, his shout of fury, echoed behind them, but Anya didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had Alexei now, and she would protect him, no matter what. As they disappeared into the night, the cold wind carrying them away from the camp, Anya's heart pounded in her chest. The world had not grown any kinder, and the fight was far from over, but in that fleeting moment as she held her son tightly, she felt a surge of hope, something she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. They had escaped. They were free. For now, at least. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and the ceaseless march of time. Anya could feel every muscle in her body aching from the cold, the weight of the weeks behind her, and the brutal hours spent fleeing through the snow. She had never thought much about survival before the war, about how precious each breath could become when every step forward carried the risk of everything slipping away. But now, with Alexei in her arms, the journey had taken on a new meaning, a new urgency. They had kept moving through the night after escaping the soldiers' camp. Anya had no plan, no destination, just the instinct to get as far away from those men as possible. She had kept Alexei close, clutching him tightly as though he might vanish the moment she let go. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The sound of their pursuers' shouts had been like thunder in her ears, echoing through the night air, and every time the wind shifted, it seemed as if she might hear them again, coming closer, relentless in their search. The trees blurred past them, and the snow beneath their feet crunched with every step as they fled deeper into the wilderness. There was no road, no path to follow. There was only the forest, the wilderness, and the relentless cold that threatened to freeze them both. She hadn't realized how far they had traveled until the dawn began to break. The pale light of morning filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the snow. They were deep in the forest now, far from the village, far from the soldiers, and far from any sense of safety. Anya stopped for a moment, breathless, her heart pounding with the effort it took to keep moving. She looked down at Alexei, who had fallen silent in her arms, his small face pale, his eyes tired but still alert. "Mom, where are we going?" Alexei asked, his voice soft, almost uncertain as he looked up at her, his little face streaked with dirt and tears. Anya paused for a moment, her fingers brushing through his disheveled hair. She didn't have an answer for him. She didn't know where they were going. All she knew was that they had to keep going, that if they stopped, if they waited too long, the soldiers would catch up and she would lose him again. She couldn't let that happen. Not after everything they had been through. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, her voice hoarse, even though she didn't believe it herself. "We'll find a safe place." Alexei didn't respond, but she could feel his small hand gripping her jacket, holding on tight as if he were afraid that if he let go, he would fall into the same abyss of darkness that had already swallowed so much of their world.